Ocular by Iniquity. Chapter 14. He was alone when he woke up, with only a letter.
Am. Called to work early by Jim Washington. Breakfast on table. Then you are to be back to bed. If I am to find you at your desk, I will be quite upset. Rest if you are ill. Back when I am able. Yours forever, John Lawrence.
He folded the letter and put it in his pocket. It had a comforting sort of weight to it, not unlike the warm memory of their coupling the previous evening. He quickly distracted himself from considering the events in too much detail lest he find himself desiring his Lawrence again. Instead, he peeked out of the tent and cursed himself for having no idea what time it was. It was morning, or perhaps early afternoon. A man waved hello to him. He smiled and pulled back into his tent. Usually he was alone. Not even Burr had been fetched to watch him. He considered for a long moment escaping out of the tent and down to Washington's headquarters to have something assigned to him. But he realized he did not wish to upset Lawrence after the men had been so kind to him in the night time. One should not upset the man that they loved. It felt almost as if he was a healthy human being when he stood to recover the bread on the table. There was a flask there as well, along with a shiny red apple. He suppressed all but a snort of laughter, imagining his favorite French aristocrat sneaking through the dark, stealing food like a common thief. It was then that he noticed the 3 items were accompanied by a chipped mug. There was no way God could be so great as to have blessed him with coffee! Even so, he could not help himself but dare to hope. He looked down into the mug. It certainly looked like coffee. Had Lafayette sold a bit of his soul to acquire this on his behalf? Perhaps Lawrence had gotten some from his father. Alexander had not been aware that there was any coffee even left to steal. He picked up the mug and brought it to his lips. Even cold, it was more marvelous than he had words for. He could write essays about the spectacular taste of this coffee. He would talk forever about the bitter flavor bursting on his tongue and the power that suddenly surged in his blood. He decided to himself that there was no obstacle, even their ever-present famine, that Lawrence and Lafayette could not overcome. They would grow, pick, roast, grind, and steep the beans themselves if it meant coffee. He added the whiskey after a second thought, finished the apple and the bread, and studied the tent. The drink infused him with unfamiliar energy. He put his hand in his pocket, touched the letter, and stared longingly at his desk. The general might have excused him for ignoring the order if he added something of value to the cause, but he did not suspect Lawrence would do the same. He moved his inkwell, pen, and stack of papers down to his pile of blankets, and found one of his law books to write upon again. "Take that, Lafayette!" he muttered, and resumed his essay in progress. Writing felt good. It was the first true and honest sign that he could acknowledge that perhaps his recovery would stay permanent this time, rather than him falling back into delirium. He did not feel as bogged down by the dizziness or the blurring letters that seemed to have dogged him, although he could feel the symptoms lurking like wolves in the darkness. If he truly managed to shake off those symptoms, perhaps he could get a more proper assignment once Lawrence permitted him to accomplish his regular tasks. But as it was, his essay would have to do, abolition being a valuable cause in and of itself, regardless of the revolution. He admitted privately that the battle of slavery would be one he was looking forward to. He could imagine the arguments. He could see himself striking them down one by one. It would take time, of course. Lawrence would be with him, of course. He could not write for too long. The dizziness came and went, and more regularly if he stared at the page without looking up, and his arm began to ache, different from the familiar pains that would strike his fingers and his wrist. When he could no longer hold the pen, he would put it down and work on arranging the disastrous mess of their tent, and hope at the same time Lawrence would not find him outside of his blankets. At least the writing and the cleaning allowed him to pass the time. If he were to be trapped in his tent like a prisoner, the least he could do would be work on some small side projects that had been bumped off his to-do list by Washington's orders. There had been this and a few other essays. He had also been reading several pieces regarding monetary policy, because there was no way he would allow their new nation to be so poor, hungry, and ill-equipped like their army was. He had not yet begun to write down what their country would have to look like to both avoid oppressing the citizens by stealing their hard-earned money, but still managing to fund itself, but it was percolating in his mind. When his arm no longer throbbed, he picked up the pen and started writing again, and he wrote and wrote and wrote, the thoughts coming fast. It was a familiar, wonderful feeling to be consumed by his own ideas again. He would be better. He would improve. It was darker. Hours must have passed. He had not seen Lawrence in some time. The man must have been terribly busy. He ignored the rumblings of his stomach and set the paper to the side, moving the inkwell so that he did not accidentally knock it over. Perhaps he would try to sleep a little more, no matter what time it was. Lawrence would be happy to know he was taking care of himself, and perhaps it would speed along his improvement, for there was no way Washington let him fight in the battle, nonetheless give him any sort of command, if he did not appear in perfect health. It was only at this point that he saw the boots. It was a very large pair of boots, and they were well shined, especially in comparison to his own sad pair. He knew who those boots belonged to. "Your Excellency, sir," he said, slowly looking up until he met the general's eyes. He did realize, at least, that it was good he was not at his desk. "I didn't hear you come in," said Washington, who was sitting in Lawrence's chair, watching him with intent. Clearly, it had been the man's goal to observe him without notice. Alexander knew that he had a tendency to be absorbed in his work, but that his 6-foot general could sneak into his tent and study him without him noticing, he did not know for how long, was perhaps a new step in that direction, encouraging on his path to wellness, if nothing else. "Do you have new orders for me, sir?" he asked.
No, you are still to remain in your blankets.
"I can transcribe your letters from my blankets, sir."
Perhaps tomorrow, if you are to continue to improve.
"Is there any further assistance I can provide for you or to the cause?" Washington gazed at him in the almost silence of the tent surrounded by the busy camp.
You should know that Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence expressed to me that, while he professionally felt you would be well enough to fight, he seemed to feel a fair bit of hesitancy at the thought of you being in the battle. If it was his decision, you would remain at camp with the rest of the sick and wounded."
"Sir!" Alexander sat up straighter, anger exploding hot in his chest along with a burst of dizziness. "And how dare, Lawrence! I am more than capable of entering the battle now, and I will certainly improve, especially as I can go nowhere."
But,
Washington's voice was sharp, and it stopped him mid-rant.
unfortunately, as much as I would grandly like to hold you back for the sake of the Lieutenant Colonel, as well as the many others who are concerned for your health, including myself, I am not permitted the luxury of such nursemaiding while we fight in a war where we are so outmatched in every way. I must have all the soldiers that can fight doing so, and I must have them even if their loss would cause great pain to others."
A little hope began to replace the anger, like the first sight of ground after snowfall.
"However, I am able to make choices about where those men are in the battle."
Washington barely blinked, and the man's gaze held Alexander motionless. He never felt more exposed than with the general's eyes on him. If Lawrence looked at him like an embrace, and Burr looked at him like a pistol, Washington looked at him like a magnifying glass, seeing him more clearly and with more precision than even he could in a mirror. He could hide nothing.
"So, while you will be there, I have reassigned you to rear guard, and I do not expect you to face any serious combat. If you feel weak or dizzy, you are to retreat. You are not to make your way to the front lines. Do not ask me for command. Do I make myself clear?"
It was definitely a compromise, but it was one that would put him on the field of battle, where he would gather experience. It would be a way for him to gain glory and reputation, and others would know that despite his illness, he had appeared. He had not been held back because he was weak. It was no command, but it was something. "Yes, sir," he said. Washington stood up the best he could and looked away from him.
"As an aside, Hamilton, you may be interested to hear that there has been a theft in the camp."
Alexander followed the general's eyes to where they were fixed on the apple core on his desk. The small flower of hope in his chest exploded into terror, and he could not help but look up panic before his coldest features into what he hoped was a curious confusion. "A theft, sir?" he asked, trying for the most innocent tone of voice he could manage. Even he would admit that it was a terrible, blatantly transparent attempt. Aside from the usual troubles, what could be of note?
A man stole General Lee's dinner.
Washington replied, and he moved over to pick the apple core up and study it. He had turned slightly away from Alexander, shielding his expression.
It was chicken, as I recall, and port. There may have been something else that I am forgetting.
He put the apple core in his pocket.
As you can imagine, he was quite upset and threatened severe punishments on the man or men who took it, if they are ever found, regardless of their station or rank.
Were I not ordered to be on bed rest in my tent, sir, as I have been for the past several days, I would look immediately for these criminals. Alexander managed, although he could not deny that his tone of voice sounded odd even to his own ears. He glad that Washington was no longer looking at him.
I am sure you would, and report them immediately, as I know you hold General Lee in high esteem.
It seemed only a miracle that Washington kept his voice so even on what they both knew to be a bald-faced lie.
Although, as the general is now aware of these events, him and his guard will certainly be on high alert now, and should the thief strike again, he will surely be caught.
The general took a breath, and then turned to face him with narrowed eyes.
Were you to find this thief, I hope you would let him know that despite any differences in opinion, this petty theft is terribly disrespectful and reeks of remarkably poor discipline. This thief should know that they shake the bonds of the very thing that holds this army together, and they dishonor me and themselves with it despite their intentions. I need not remind you that the general still grandly outranks everyone in this camp besides me, and it would not be outside his bounds to bring great harm to the offending party in any number of ways.
I would let them know that immediately, sir, if I were to discover them. Washington nodded.
As I had thought. I will send Lawrence if I need you again.
Yes, sir, Alexander said and saluted. The general left the tent. Alexander stared at his desk where the apple core had been. Despite the improvement, he also knew that had he been completely well, he would not have made such a rudimentary error.